years studying blacksmiths, it would be pottery and blacksmiths in Alabama. But there are a few things about potters that maybe are different than blacksmiths and other kind of regular folks in Alabama. And that is that where they worked was kind of a semi-public place. It was, you could go there to buy pottery, and making pottery in the 19th century required a 36-hour-long firing period where, I mean, just you had to watch the fire raising the temperature gradually so that the pottery wouldn't break. But they made a party out of it. And so men especially were the potters. You would say to your wife or your parents, oh, I'm going to tend the kiln with Mr. So-and-so. But what you were really doing is telling lies, drinking whiskey, talking politics. But because these were public places, sometimes they were also polling places. And like the famous polling place at what is now Gardendale, but was called Jugtown. This is in Detroit, Alabama, in close to the kind of on the Lamar County, Marion County line, Northwest Alabama, was also a polling place at one time. And that whole community was called Ride Jug Factory or Ride Jug Shop because of the family that ran it. And here's just a close-up of a very famous painting by Bingham from 1854 entitled, I think, American County Election or something like that. Well, alcohol played a big part in politics, but there's a lot more to pottery making in the 19th century than making containers for alcohol. But we don't, I mean, modern Americans don't know that. In fact, even towards the end of the 19th century, when the pottery trade changed and potters were losing their market to things made of metal and glass, the pottery jug still remained involved in distilling and legal or illegal in people's minds, and also kind of a sight gag. You know, it was funny because it was related to drinking. And so you would get people posing for pictures like this. I love this photograph from Wetumpka, 1934. I love it for a couple of reasons. One is I know who made these pots. This was made by an enslaved potter at the Evan Presley Pottery near Millbrook. And this one by the Mulder family in Redland in Elmore County. But what I also like about this is this guy here is Hardy Jackson's grandfather. And he shared this on Facebook, and I told him who made the jugs. But it's just an example. These guys aren't really drunk, but it's just a sight gag. Now, everyone was affected by politics, just like we are today, whether you're a participant or not. And I want to start this slide about this family and the tragic story of this family, who John Bowen Pitchford and Nancy migrated from the northern part of Georgia in the mountains. They made pottery. They made a particular kind of southern glazed pottery, green, slick, ash glazed pottery, alkaline glazed pottery, can also be made with lime. That's just what Deep South potters did. And they came into North Alabama, all the way to Northwest Alabama, and went to work for a potter who was from Tennessee and made a totally different kind of pottery. So he adapted to that. And the Tennessee potters made salt glazed pottery. And you see that orange peel texture. And I'm going to put these shards down if y'all want to come up and look at them more closely. It's distinctive when you look up close, that orange peel texture. The interesting thing about this family is they came all the way across, settled in what is now Lamar County, very close to Sulligent, made pottery. This little miniature was made either by him or by his future son-in-law, Mac Wilson Lloyd, the son of his employer. And it's inscribed NLIP, Nancy Louise Isabella Pitchford. And she later married this other potter, his employer's son. And this is salt glaze. This is descended in the family. They had a bunch of kids. They lost 2 sons who were younger than 2 years old. They lost 5 in the Civil War, 4 in battle, 1 in a POW camp. But 2 lived to be in their 90s. So there's always a silver lining. But after the war, after this incredible impact on the war, they left and became Oklahoma Sooners with some other families from this part of the state. But I start that out by saying there was a lot of diversity in pottery styles and people making pottery. And people like Tennesseans and Georgians got thrown together. And it helped to make Alabama pottery unique. And right from the beginning, right in the very earliest days of statehood, you had this northern style of pottery. Also Europeans brought it in the Port of Mobile. But people like Daniel Cribbs, a really well-known early settler of Tuscaloosa. A lot of you nodding your heads, you've heard of him. Cribbs Creek, Jug Factory Road. If you've been to the original Dreamland, it's on Jug Factory Road, named after his jug factory, and he made salt glaze stoneware. Really an incredible individual, and I'll get more into him in a second. But the Southern style also came into the state also in the early 1820s from South Carolina, primarily by way of Georgia. And there in South Carolina, in the Edgefield district, potters developed this green glazed pottery. You made it literally with wood ashes out of your fireplace, out of your smokehouse. And also, as I mentioned, lime, which had other uses, and people made lime from limestone. And John Presley came to Montgomery County in the early 1820s. He didn't come to Randolph County, where a lot of potters later worked, because it was still Indian Nation. So he went through around the Indian Nation to come, and he happened to be the father-in-law of Abner Landrum, who was the one who really started this kind of pottery making in the Edgefield district using enslaved potters. So the potters who came in from the north of the mountains in Alabama, like Cribbs, who came from Ohio, made the salt glaze pottery. People who came south of the mountains into places like Montgomery County made this green color. This is a wood ash. This pot here is upstairs. You can see it. It was made by the man who bought John Presley's pottery from him. This is an 1829 announcement in the newspaper that sale had gone through. So you're going to say, oh, I know where he's going with this in terms of politics. Not so fast. Cribbs was a slave owner. Even though he was from Ohio, his father was a slave owner. His father, in fact, had 2 enslaved people listed in the 1820 census. Say, wait, Ohio's a free state. Yeah, it was. But that mainly meant that you could not engage in commerce in the slave trade. You know, Dred Scott decision had not happened yet. So there was a lot of ambiguity if you brought an enslaved person into a free state. By 1830, his dad no longer had any enslaved people. And so I don't know what that means. They were 2 older women that were enslaved by him. They could have passed away. They could have bought their own freedom. We don't know. They could have gone with other family members somewhere else. By 1830, though, all of his sons were in Alabama, 2 making pottery and one running a newspaper in Greensboro, Alabama. They eventually resettled up into Tuscaloosa County. And he made pottery, and he is a really intriguing character. He, at the age of 13, was a military courier during the War of 1812, took a dispatch to Detroit from an American general. This photo could have been made in California because he went to the gold rush and he made a lot of money. Not so much. Are you a Cribb? Are you a descendant of a Cribb?
No, I work here as a collections archivist.
So you know.
Some Mitchell Cribb's family papers right now for his son.
Okay. Well, see, the wonderful thing about researching a family like the Cribbs is the family themselves had done so much great research, and they were somewhat prominent. He served as sheriff in Tuscaloosa County. He had a grist mill. He had a pottery. He owned a steamboat. He owned a paddle wheeler named the Tuscaloosa. It blew up in 1845. So maybe to recover from that, he went to California. He did not mine for gold, I don't think, because he's listed in the 1852 Placer County, California census as a trader. I think he was a provisioner and being a businessman, but his son, who lived next door, was listed as a gold miner. And there were women from the family. His daughter came, and I think a cousin, and I think they helped him with his business and keeping house there in California. But he came back to Alabama, invested his money, the family says, in buying more enslaved workers and another paddle wheeler. I'm not exactly sure. He started out with one free man of color in his household in 1830 and an enslaved woman. By the 1840s and 50s, he owned around 15 enslaved people, mostly men. He actually had 3 women in 1860 working alongside 10 men in his pottery making, which was very unusual because women, and I feel like they may have been enslaved women because typically women did not work in pottery shops. They had too much other stuff to do, to be blunt, with large families and running healthcare for families and so forth. But he's fascinated. What's even more fascinating and an enigma is he was census enumerator with his son Philander, and you have to be careful how you pronounce Philander's name. The same son who went to California with him, they were census enumerators for 1860. And at the end of the census, they write, Ohio faithful, faithful Ohio. Well, what do you mean by that? He was a slave owner. He was a Jacksonian Democrat, so hardly a liberal. I don't know. Maybe he was just against secession, which is my interpretation of this, because later, after the war, he very much was a Democrat during Reconstruction, opposing Reconstruction, very visibly so. His son organized an artillery unit for the Confederacy, his son Harvey. And so we know he supported the Confederacy. It's just one of these things. One reason I like to give talks like this is that it shows how complicated history is. We tend to simplify it. We tend to simplify even the past in our own lives. How many Facebook friends have you had that said, oh, times were simpler and more innocent when we were a kid? Well, that's not how I remember the 1960s. But some people remember them that way. And some people remember these times that way, but they were not simple or innocent. Now, I do want to point out this. Cribbs married into the Lavergie family, and his mother-in-law owned more human property than he did, and in fact owned 2 potters. And so when she took out a loan, she listed them as collateral and made a point of saying that they were potters because that made them that much more valuable on the market. And they undoubtedly worked for him. And so he would pay his mother-in-law for these skilled workers. And I want to just take a moment to name some of those enslaved potters who worked in Alabama. As y'all know, most of you, researching African Americans is problematic because researching working class anyone in America is problematic because they didn't leave a big paper trail. That's especially true of African Americans. And so through things like that loan document and the 1870 census, where African Americans remained in the pottery business, having taken the surname of their former master, is how we get these names here. And all of these pots were made by enslaved potters. These by the Cribbs, through the Cribbs factory, and this in Coushatta at Evan Presley's factory, where Evans was the son of John Presley, the man I mentioned earlier. And he had a couple of white potters that worked for him, but most of his pottery makers were enslaved. And then later, after emancipation, he hired them as wage earners. Edmund Presley being one of those. Edmund's name comes up more, and I tend to think of him as one of the principal potters. And you get your information however you can get it when you're researching these kind of traditions. Because I bought this pot, this jug, from a bottle digger who dug it out of a well in Wetumpka. I knew it didn't look like the Mulders, what the Mulder family made in Redland a little later. And so I just assumed, I think correctly so, it was made at Evan Presley's pottery nearby. And then another pottery collector came up with an identical one they found in Alex City. And then my friend Mike McEachern, who is an authority on Alabama stereo views, found this stereo view odd, to say the least, in a series marketed by Montgomery photographer Lakin in the 1870s of the old Confederate Capitol. See the Capitol, see the major churches, see the cemetery, all these stereo views that you could order if you wanted to visit Montgomery virtually. And they did. Well, apparently there wasn't any cotton growing or any in bloom. So he came up with this ridiculous setting of putting a dried out cotton plant in a jug on a table in a pasture. So now people look at this and say, oh, look at that snake fence. And oh, look at that piece of furniture. Oh, look at that jug. And he really wanted you to look at this cotton plant, but whatever. But, and this is a close up and it is the same. It is the absolute same jug. And this photograph dates from 1870. So now there were some real Confederate potters in the state of Alabama, Falkner family being one of them. One of the kind of sub-stories of Alabama pottery is the Indians left and potters and other settlers came in to East Alabama. The Indians were forcibly removed. One such family were the Falkners, and they made this nice lime-based glaze, alkaline glazed pottery in Randolph County. And then these little migrations, some people went to Texas, but some people just went to Shelby County or Perry County, and just stayed within the state or Sand Mountain. And so they went to Sterrett in Shelby County and made beautiful pottery. Went there in 1857. One of them dated this jar, 1859. But early on in the war, Falkner said, here's a business opportunity. I don't know if he was thinking about a future blockade or simply just the fact that buy from a Southern potter and not an import from either Europe or the North. And so what he did, and thanks to Debbie Pendleton, I found out about this, archivist here and friend, is he petitioned the governor of Alabama to be exempted, he and his pottery workers, from the draft, from military service. And he makes a really impressive argument here, how important it for local manufacturers will be to the South, and that's true, including pottery. But what he didn't mention, I think, by design, is that at least 3 of his workers were his sons. But the governor denied this. Governor's office denied this. They all went into military service. The son survived, and Joel did not. He was in the reserves, called up late in the war, died, we think, of disease as a prisoner in Mobile, buried in Confederate rest in Magnolia Cemetery in Mobile, which is an unusual resting place for a mountain potter, but nevertheless. When Cribbs came in to Tuscaloosa with his salt glazed pottery, that became a salt glazed pottery market, so that any other potter that came in there switched. And quite a few people tried to compete with Cribbs, especially in a different part of the county near Foster's, a little community called Romulus. Here are a succession of pottery owners in Romulus. Same pottery, same clay pit, different owners by decade, but from census records. This 10-year slice of life is what you get when you're doing historical research for many Alabamians. And so old Joseph Meharry, it's the only image I could find of him, had to hire a potter. He was a big landowner, but someone said, you have good clay on your land. So he hires a potter, starts a pottery, splits the proceeds with the potter. Potter happens to be Benjamin Williams, another one of these alkaline glaze potters from Randolph County. After the war, William Jones comes in, the first Black owner of a pottery in Alabama, I'm almost certain. Who he was, we don't know. We don't think he was a potter. The census record shows that he didn't own a lot of real estate, but he did have quite a bit of just personal property. And so he had some means. I think, he just went in, hired a potter from somewhere, possibly a formerly enslaved potter from Cribs, who knows, to make pottery. And he made it there for a while, at least until 1869 during the Reconstruction period. And he had several different marks. He had that mark, William Jones, and this one, salt glazed pottery. But he went out of business. At the end of Reconstruction, he's gone. I've tried to figure out who he is. He's an apprentice to a painter, and I think house versus portrait in Mississippi, not listed as a man of color. Listed as a Black man in 1870 census, and then after the war goes back to Noxubee, Mississippi as a farmer. Listed as a farmer in the regular census in Tuscaloosa, but in the census of manufacturers as the owner of this pottery. We just don't know. He could have been a relative of Shandy Jones, who's a very well-known barber, free man of color in antebellum Tuscaloosa. He's a very light-skinned man. His father was his enslaver. He was free. He was emancipated at the age of 3 in the Tennessee Valley, along with his mom and 2 sisters. And for some reason, he came to Tuscaloosa instead of staying in the Tennessee Valley. Don't know if that was coerced or not, but he came, and he was a lightning rod among other lightning rods. Reconstruction period in Tuscaloosa was lively and violent, and is very well documented, has been researched and written about. And he received many death threats. He made the point of marrying a free woman of color. So Guy Hubbs writes about this, historian, to ensure that his children would be free from the get-go. And she was African and Choctaw heritage. And they had a large family, including a William, this one. But it's not the same William, because they appear in the same census, and they're different ages. So we don't know. It could be a stretch, but this gives me a segue into talking about the viciousness of Reconstruction, where this is the most notorious of the Reconstruction papers, the Independent Monitor of Tuscaloosa, where the editor Randolph was a politician who, and Jones served in the legislature too. So, they were at different ends of the political spectrum, obviously. And he received so many death threats that President Grant eventually appointed him as an inspector in Mobile to get him. He got out of town for his own safety. He had to go into hiding before he got that job. And you can just see the over-the-top vicious ad hominem rhetoric that was flying around at that time. But in researching this little community of Romulus, this is Ralph Miller. He was born in 04. I interviewed him in 01 of the next century. And I was interviewing Ralph, and he was talking about the cork hole, the clay pit they used, he called the cork hole. Well, for all these years, pottery researchers, like some of my friends in the audience, thought that said James Cook because of the cursive writing. Well, Ralph said, oh no. And this is Abraham Miller's grandson. So Cork, who took over for Jones at the end of Reconstruction, he was just a large landowner, a Confederate, but he hired Ralph's grandfather, Abraham Miller, the beginning of that long line of Miller potters who are still working in Alabama today on Highway 5. More about Ralph later. More Confederate potters, this time in Randolph County. I talked a lot about Randolph County. Which one is the rich kid? It's pretty easy to tell from this photograph. You know, I was talking to some folks earlier, and how long do you think all these stilettos and pocket pistols lasted after his first long march? Probably not very long. But this is the son of a very prosperous lawyer, Cicero Demosthenes Hudson. Great name for a lawyer, right? And Felix was his son. And Felix joined. His dad allowed him to join. He was under 18, so he had to have his dad's permission to join the Army. And this is T.J. Henry, and he probably didn't have a choice of whether or not to join the Army. His father became a Unionist during the war. His brother-in-law was a Union soldier. All of this in Randolph and Chambers County, right on the county line. Here's Randolph. This happened during Reconstruction. This is W.T. Belcher, the brother-in-law of T.J. Henry, who was represented and deposed by Cicero Hudson after this incident. This was reported in 2 newspapers, and I want you to see that the media has always had a spin. And so, you know, this is from a pro-Confederate, anti-Reconstruction paper talking about the time that the Klan came to the Belcher household in Bacon Level, Alabama, because William had been a Union soldier and drove a wagon for Sherman, and they wanted maybe to lynch him, maybe just to intimidate him from voting, who knows. Well, he shot 2 of them. This one cast aspersions to that, but he did. He shot 2 and then ran them off. Here's another, and by the way, this is General George Meade. I think his initials were G.G. Meade, so they're trying to be funny with the Ku Klux, KK. But anyway, here is the other account of the same incident. This is from a more pro-friendly, Reconstruction-friendly newspaper that talks about what happened. Now, the only reason that I thought to try to find an account of this is because records have been digitized by the good people in this building and others across the country. And just a few years ago, a descendant of the Hudsons was doing family research. He also happens to be a library specialist in Shelby County schools. And she found this report published here in Montgomery about Klan outrages in Alabama. And in it, it recounts the Belcher family. But guess what? It's not that one. It's actually what the Klan did to Belcher's dad, Edmund, because what those newspapers refer to an event that happened in the late spring. This happened in the fall. So what happened was, after he ran them off with shooting his pistol at the Klan, they came back 4 or 5 months later. He wasn't at home. So they roughed up his dad. They drug him out of the house. They beat him up. They put a rope around his neck. They made him run through his field, whatever he was growing, until he was exhausted, and that did it. They had reported the earlier incident to the federal authorities. Cicero Hudson became a Union man because his son signed up for a year, but the Army decided it was for the war. So he sued the Confederate government. The case was written about. Felix, he won the case. It was written about in the Charlotte paper and the Richmond paper. It was a big case about habeas corpus in the very short life of Confederate jurisprudence, but it was one. And they found for the Hudsons, you cannot keep a recruit under the age of 18 whose family has petitioned him to come out of the Army. Now, I don't know if that lasted for the whole war, but in 1863, they won that judgment. And that was one reason I think that Cicero Hudson became a Union man and became a commissioner. And he could sign out warrants and get people arrested using federal troops, and did. But in this report, he and another wealthy attorney, R.S. Heflin, and I don't know what relation he may be to the Heflin families that later became prominent in politics in Alabama. They took depositions. In this instance of the old man being roughed up, there were 2 depositions, one taken by Hudson, one by Heflin. And this is the part I want you to see. They said, we've had it. We're out of here. We're getting the hell out of Dodge City, and they did. And they went to Sand Mountain. These are the people that went to Sand Mountain. This is Belcher and Mary, their daughters, Rebecca and Mary again, and their son W.T. in older years on Sand Mountain. Same guy. This was the guy that I showed in the early Confederate photo on the right as an older man. And they married Arch McPherson, T.J. Henry, the daughters did, and they all went up to Sand Mountain to get out of there. Both of these men served in the Confederate Army, but they went with their family for safety. And their response, they've started this whole pottery making community that's very famous today, very famous among collectors. Go to eBay, type in Sand Mountain Pottery, you get all kinds of returns. Most of it's not really Sand Mountain Pottery, but that's okay. They made beautiful, very distinctive pottery, very shiny, imaginative use of decoration and glaze. More Sand Mountain Pottery. This was still at the time when pottery making was lucrative. People had to have storage jars to store food. They had to have churns to churn butter. They had to have milk pitchers. And most of those big jugs were not for whiskey. They were for molasses or syrup or cider or turpentine or kerosene or whatever. And the little half-gallon ones, those were the whiskey jugs, as you can see here. This little shouldered whiskey jug at a local tavern on Sand Mountain, well after the Civil War. A few potters like John Lehman of Randolph County made symbolic wares. Now, Lehman probably was commissioned to make these pieces, and we don't know exactly what these pieces are, what they're supposed to be. But there are some clues. Obviously, a fabulous potter. Political pottery is old. It goes back to Europe. One of the most well-known forms in Europe is of an ovoid jug with a man's bearded face on the neck. That's called a Bellarmine jug. Originally made as a spoof, as a caricature of a Catholic cardinal, but the form took a life of its own and was made for centuries in Europe. Toby jugs, that's a European. This is a European form made by a German-American immigrant in Alabama who also made these things. And Lehman is a kind of a mysterious character himself. This is how he made his money most days, not those fancy ones that have survived and are in big museums today. Now this is kind of a fancy piece and a little unusual, but this is what he sold to feed his family. We didn't know much about Lehman until I was over here in the research room, and I said, oh, what the heck? I'm going to look through the oaths of loyalty for Randolph County, and everybody said, there's not a lot of information other than the fact that someone signed an oath. so that they could get their voting rights back after having been a Confederate soldier. Well, this had naturalization information written at the bottom. And so I was able to trace, and I think this is our John Lehman, even though the middle initial D is not what most people think his middle initial was, because there aren't very many Lehmans in Randolph County who are German, who say they're from Württemberg in later censuses, and that's what we learned from this. He came in through New York, went down the Ohio Valley, eventually to New Orleans. This is the kind of stuff they made in the Ohio Valley: sprig molded, decorated stoneware. And so he could have easily learned that technique. But it's a very unusual migration pattern for an Alabama potter to come in here, go around the Ohio Valley, and come down to New Orleans. We know he was in New Orleans because he's listed in the newspaper at a couple of different places as working at the Virgin Pottery, the William Virgin's Pottery, a Irish potter, near Tulane, close to where Tulane is located. And this is some information. Not only did he work there on his way to Alabama, he was in Alabama by 1860, but during Reconstruction, probably because no one had any money in Randolph County, he went back to New Orleans and made pottery again at the same people he already knew. And he would have worked with Joseph Fortune Meyer, who also worked at this for these Irish American potters. But he kept coming back to Alabama. Every year he's enumerated, he's living in Randolph County, Alabama. He was a Confederate soldier. He married into a Georgia pottery making family, the Taylors, married a Taylor woman, worked for his father-in-law for a little while, went off to the war. And this is kind of what we've pieced together, again, mainly using some local recently digitized records. There's a lot of intriguing things, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but after his death, when his widow was receiving his Confederate pension, she wrote in, or someone wrote in, that he had served under Captain Hines in the Confederate Army. There was a very notorious Captain Hines who was an agent provocateur who busted some Confederate generals out of a prison in Kentucky, was linked to the Lincoln assassination conspirators, tried to stir up trouble on behalf of the Confederacy in Canada. If it's the same Hines, it's a long shot. But wouldn't it be, if you were operating behind enemy lines in the Ohio Valley, wouldn't it have been a great asset to have a bilingual German-English guy who had lived in that area before? It's a long shot. Maybe we'll find out. What we do know is after he was injured, they gave him a job making chamber pots for the Confederacy. And the thing about this group of documents that's been digitized by the National Archive and is available now are business dealings the Confederate government had with citizens in the South, including potters. But in this case, they had a soldier making pottery in a pottery near what is now Phoenix City, Alabama. But it took them forever to get the paperwork through to make these. And finally, a month before Lee's surrender, he finally gets down there, gets paid for making the pottery gets paid for making the bedpans. And this is what a chamber pot looked like in those days. So during Reconstruction, we think all of these political pots were made during Reconstruction. This is one of two presidential jars. These are both owned by the Birmingham Museum of Art, and you can see them. One is a Jefferson Jackson jar, Democratic Party, right? But the other one is a Washington Jefferson jar. What were these used for? Maybe punch, spiked punch at a party. Who knows? Maybe a primary, maybe a vote, you put your ballots in there for a primary within the party. Who knows? But he was commissioned to make these. They both still exist. They're both signed with his initials. And when you compare it to other pieces we know he made, these are huge. These stand, all of these pieces are very large except for the Toby pitcher. They stand almost a yard tall. And the Revelation jar. This is one side of the Revelation jar. The other side has the seal of the United States. Now, this is a famous passage from the Bible, and but its symbolism can be used by everybody. So what he meant, if he's working for a Democrat trying to reestablish democratic rule during Reconstruction in Alabama, chances are that the big bad black Republican radicals are the beast that gets thrown back into the pit by the angel. Who knows? But for a long time, I thought maybe these were just pieces made for the nation's centennial. But with that Revelation imagery, I don't know. As you can see, it pops up everywhere, and it's definitely open to interpretation. There were all kinds of over-the-top metaphors used during the Reconstruction period. Some of them biblical, some of them otherwise, some of them very racist, exaggerated racial features in cartoons and on pottery. These are also by Lehman. These are the only three figural pieces we know other than the Toby jug. These also stand about about a yard high. They're huge. This one is owned by the High Museum. I think this one is by the Birmingham Museum, and this one owned by a private individual. I think that these probably were made to represent black politicians sitting either in Montgomery or Washington. The interesting thing about this triptych is, and maybe there are others out there, but one of them looks straight on and the other two look this way. It's almost as though they were meant to be, presented together. And maybe one is, rapier, or one is, specific black politicians who were elected to represent the citizens. I think that's probably what this is. One thing that's probably not is jugs used for jug breakings. And I ran across this, and I had never heard of this, but these were fundraisers similar to cakewalks. And they were all over the country, and they were for all different kinds of causes. But this one in Marion County, near Marion in Perry County, was to pay for a Confederate memorial, not the late Confederate memorials that about the lost cause and all that were put up near the turn of the century. This one was right not that long after the war, 4 Confederate dead and placed in a cemetery. And there was a whole generation of those. And this one was specifically for the dead that didn't come home. In other words, laying on a battlefield somewhere that never came back to Perry County. And the way they did this was the little kids went out and collected pennies and nickels and put them in a jug. And then they would have a big party, break open the jugs, and it was girls. The girl who had collected the most money for the Confederate memorial was the queen of that particular event or whatever. And so because this is Perry County and because there was so much pottery made there, I guess the potters could have made special jugs for jug breakings. I just don't know, because they were probably all broken. We may never know. But it's interesting to think that they could have. They were certainly capable. I doubt very seriously they were as elaborate as Lehman's. Our old friend, Abraham Miller, another Northern potter that came to the South, married the widow of a Confederate soldier. He was killed in the war. She, the daughter of French potters on Mobile Bay. He was wandering around the South during Reconstruction by himself. This is a transcript from my interview with Ralph Miller, his grandson, who actually went to the courthouse with his grandfather when he first signed up for a Civil War pension in the 1920s. Why was he not collecting a pension until the 1920s? He was waiting for his Confederate wife to die because he was a Union soldier. And when he went to the courthouse and he told everybody that had known him for decades that he was in the Union Army, everyone just fell out. And that his name wasn't Miller, but it was Cole. But he collected a pension, but as Ralph said, about 4 years. He lost a lot of money keeping that political secret. He had a buddy named Saul Hamlet, just a little bit too young to be in the Confederate Army, but he was a real character. And they both worked together north of Sprott in a little community called Pintucky. And Solomon was a character. He apparently was a great storyteller. He was a ladies' man. He was scandalous. He drank. He was the Pintucky correspondent for the Marion newspaper. So he had a blog. And but this is what he made when he was a very young man working with these older potters in Pintucky. This is Saul. He was a huge man. Ralph remembered him. He said he was a giant of a man. And you can tell he's a large guy, powerfully built. He went by Saul, but his real name was Robert Solomon Ham. And he was the talk of the town. He loved to, if things were happening with Saul was there, telling lies. And then I don't know if people wrote in his name on the election or if he was actually running for office, but he was always giving his opinion about politics and threatening to run for office. We're not really sure if he ever did, but he was still really making his money as a potter. His first wife, he had a large family with. About 4 or 5 of those sons became potters. In fact, they had later Ham Brothers Pottery. But he got mixed up in the whole Prohibition issue, political issue. Temperance from the antebellum period through kind of turned into the Prohibition issue. And one of the hot topics at this time was the legislator, they found out, or the law found out, people were mailing whiskey in jugs from wet counties to dry counties. Well, bootlegging, but by the mail. So all the way into the 20th century, there was various bills introduced to stop this, but how do you stop bootlegging? How do you stop people drinking whiskey? You don't. But it made for great political talk and running on platforms. And as you see, this paper was against the so-called jug law. And, and then they made this point. Well, if you pass this, it's going to be great for the potters. They'll start bootlegging and they'll sell more jugs. So anyway, I think this is my last slide. I'll leave you on this. Oh, it's the next to last slide. So this is pretty funny. The third party people, and that's the Farmers Alliance folks. This was before the 1901 Constitution. Anyway, I won't get into that. But I love this. This is part of the paper reporting that Abraham and Saul, they organized a fourth party, but failed to adopt any platform. Well, the implication is, they're up there drinking whiskey. And this kind of political interplay with pottery and local politics carried all the way in to the 20th century. There are many, many clay artists now who make political comments, studio trained potters in clay. But the traditional potters continued also. This is Irby Pope. Irby Pope ran for and was elected probate judge of Perry County for about 30 years in a row. And this is Irby Pope, the only judge. This is Irby Pope, the grandfather of a really well-known children's author, the Magic Treehouse. This is her grandfather. I have a photo of her holding this piece of pottery. This is Jerry Brown's McCain Obama double face jug. Double face jugs among potters are called politicians' jugs because they have two faces. But this one, a lot of times they would put two candidates. And this is McCain. Jerry was really proud because he put that asymmetry in McCain's face where he had a little piece of gristle on this side of his face. He said, "Look, Joey, this is McCain. Can you tell? He's got that thing on his cheek." Obviously, they don't look they don't look like either candidate. He also made a Romney Obama one, which Jerry, you have a Romney Obama. No, you had this one. Okay. So I never got that one. Anyway, that is my last slide. But if y'all have any questions, if we have time for questions, I know I went quickly. Yes.
We do have some time for questions. So if anyone in the audience has a question, if you could just wait for me to pass you the microphone so an online audience can hear it. And also if you are online, you can submit in the comments and I'll be able to ask your question for you. Anyone have a question? Excellent.
I put this pottery out too if you want to get a closer look at the difference between an alkaline glaze piece and a salt glaze piece.
Hey, is this on?
Yeah, it is.
One of those ads or something said that I already have 15,000 orders, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
You take that to be a gross exaggeration?
Yes.
Or for real? Yeah, gross
Yeah, but a good potter can make 200 to 300 jugs in a workday. So they did put it out. They put it out, but pottery making was seasonal. So when I talked to some of these old time potters, when I got started doing this research 40 years ago, they remember their fathers making wagon loads of half-gallon jugs for what they called the whiskey men who came at a certain time of the year. And so they just knew they would be needed. So thousands, that's probably an exaggeration, probably because that came from Saul Ham.
Okay. And one other question, that the thing about changing your name when you come south, my grandfather's grandfather, when he got to Nashville, he used his wife's last name. Is that a widespread thing? Are you aware
I
of it?
think that changing your name when you travel, especially if you have a reason to do it, whether you got in trouble, left a wife, was wanted, was a deserter from the army, was easy to do when you were a journeyman potter. Who knows who John Lehman really is? He may be John Lehman. He may not be John Lehman. But he left Europe in the 1840s, getting away from a really bad political situation, ended up 20 years later in another really bad political situation in America. He didn't know that, but he could have taken any identity he wanted because you're not, the law enforcement is not going to look you up on the computer. I mean, and really you could just go a few counties away and almost be out of touch in the 19th century. So I think that was, now I'm not saying your family, that's why your ancestor did that, but a lot of people did. And a lot of people coming from Europe to America especially changed their names because of the way they pronounce them here, or my family's name changed slightly, mainly because it was and so you see a lot of that also. And Americanized, names as well. So, yeah.
We do have a quick one from our online audience. They were asking, aren't you the host of a TV show on APT? And if so, can you tell us more about it?
I am. I'm the host of Journey Proud, and we did a show on pottery that was the only 1 hour show. It was the last show we did. My producer said, "Oh, Joey, we hadn't even done a pottery show yet." So we did. And we started in Randolph County at Bacon Level, and we went all the way to Mobile Bay. We are going to make at least one more Journey Proud next year, but the pandemic stopped us cold in our class. But we made 37, so thank you for asking that. Thanks for watching. Yeah.
All right, we can have this be our last question. Let me see if I can get to you.
I just was going to tell you that Robert S. Heflin is the Scalawag congressman who represented that
Yes.
district in Congress. He was from Wadowee, and William H. Smith, the governor, was also from Wadowee. They were best friends, and they were leaders of the Republican Party. And he is the uncle of Cotton Tom Heflin, the senator.
Wow.
Great uncle of Howell Heflin, the senator.
Okay. I figured there was a connection. And it's very interesting in that report where Heflin, the deposition taken by Heflin is listed, is they talked about how these activities like the Belcher incident were, they felt like, specifically voter intimidation. And they actually named the number of people that tried to cast their ballot for Grant in Randolph County. And Randolph County, you know, was a county where there was a lot of Union sentiment. It was not a big plantation county, and yet they had all of this activity in Reconstruction. I think they burned one of the Freedmen schools, if I'm not mistaken, in Randolph County during Reconstruction. One of the Lincoln conspirators was from Randolph County, the big guy, the big clean-shaven guy that you see in the photos, Powell, I think. And so, you know, it was like Tuscaloosa. It was fierce, very fierce.
Excellent. Please join me again in thanking Joey Brackner.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for coming. I hope you have a happy holiday season and to see you again in the new year when on January 19th, Catherine Braun will talk about traveling with William Bartram and friends. Thank you all so much.
That was so good.